The pre-dawn light on August 12, 1967, was supposed to bring another quiet day to the backroads of McNairy County, Tennessee. But that morning, the silence wasn't broken by birdsong. It was shattered by the roar of a V8 engine and the deafening chatter of automatic weapons. A sheriff's car, torn apart by a hailstorm of bullets, swerved violently and crashed into a ditch. Inside, a giant of a man lay drowning in his own blood, his face a ruin. Beside him, his wife was gone forever. They said it was just another violent act in a lawless land. But the old-timers in these mountains knew the truth. This wasn't just a murder. It was the climax of a one-man war. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of legend and rumor to ask one simple question. How did a man sworn to uphold the law become the most feared beast in Tennessee? To understand the storm, you first have to understand the calm that came before it. McNairy County, Tennessee, in the early 1960s, was a land of rolling hills and quiet creeks, a place where life was supposed to move at the speed of the seasons. But on its southern edge, where Tennessee bled into Mississippi, there was a festering wound known as the state line. It was a world unto itself, a kingdom of rust bucket clubs and neon-lit sin, ruled by a brutal syndicate the locals called the Dixie Mafia. Here, the only laws that mattered were bribery and violence. It was to this world that Buford Pusser returned in 1962. He wasn't a hero or a crusader. He was just a giant of a man, 6'6", and built like a Tennessee oak tree, tired of the life he'd been leading. He'd been a Marine, and he'd wrestled professionally up in Chicago as Buford the Bull. But he was done with all that. All he wanted was to come home, to build a quiet life with his wife, Pauline, and their 2 small children. He was a family man, looking for peace. You can almost picture it. A simple house, the sound of his children's laughter in the yard, the comfort of Pauline's presence. This was the dream he had traded the roar of the wrestling crowd for. A life measured not in knockouts, but in sunrises over the Tennessee hills. He wasn't looking for trouble. He believed, or maybe just hoped, that if he left the darkness on the state line alone, it would leave him alone too. But that kind of darkness doesn't stay put. It seeps into everything. The Dixie Mafia wasn't just a collection of criminals, it was an occupying army. Their illegal casinos, brothels, and moonshine operations were an open secret, protected by a wall of fear and bought-off badges. They were a cancer, and decent folk knew you didn't poke a cancer. You just prayed it didn't spread to your house. Buford's own father, Carl Pusser, was the police chief in the small town of Adamsville. He was a man who wore a badge but knew its limitations. He'd watched the state line mob operate for years, a weary, powerless spectator to their reign. He warned his son, his words heavy with the wisdom of a man who knows what monsters lurk in the shadows. "Don't go down there, son," he'd say. "Those people are snakes. They'll kill you and not even blink an eye." Buford had come home seeking a sanctuary, but he had unknowingly planted his family's flag on the doorstep of a war zone. The quiet life he craved was an illusion, and it was only a matter of time before the illusion shattered. Peace, as it turns out, was a fragile thing, and it was shattered not by some grand crusade, but by a simple, grubby act of theft. One night, Buford and a friend made the mistake of stepping into the Lucky Spot, one of the notorious clubs on the state line. It was a place that smelled of stale beer and desperation, a spider's web disguised with cheap lights. Like so many men before him, Buford found himself in a card game that was less about luck and more about predatory skill. He was cheated, plain and simple. Now, a man like Buford Pusser, a man who had wrestled bulls and served his country, was not the kind to let that stand. He didn't shout, he didn't draw a gun. He just stood up to his full, towering height and demanded his money back. It was a matter of pride. And in that den of vipers, pride was a fatal flaw. They didn't argue, they overwhelmed him. It was a flurry of fists and boots, the cold, sharp bite of a knife, and then nothing. They beat him, cut him, and left him for dead in a roadside ditch like a piece of trash. But Buford Pusser didn't die. He was found somehow and hauled to a hospital, a broken and stitched-together wreck of a man. And it was there, lying in that sterile white room, staring at the ceiling and feeling the fire of 100 different pains, that the decision was made. The quiet family man was buried in that ditch, along with his blood. Something else was clawing its way out. He knew the local law was bought and paid for. Complaining to them would be like complaining to the wolves that they'd eaten your sheep. No, this was personal. This was a debt that would be paid. This was the point of no return. In 1964, to the absolute shock of the corrupt establishment, the man they had left for dead put his name on the ballot for sheriff of McNairy County. He was only 26 years old, a political nobody. His campaign was brutally simple, a 4-word promise that was also a direct threat. I will clean this county. It was a spark in a warehouse full of dry timber. The people who had lived in the shadow of the state line mob for a generation were tired of the fear, tired of the corruption. They saw in this giant of a man not a politician, but a reflection of their own silent rage. And so they did the unthinkable. They elected him. The war had been declared. The state line mob had had enough. The bribes hadn't worked. The threats had been ignored. The stray bullets and hidden bombs had all failed. Sheriff Buford Pusser was not a problem they could manage. He was a force of nature they had to destroy. And so they set a trap, simple and brutal, baiting it with a lie. The call came in before dawn on August 12, 1967. A report of a disturbance, a routine call-out on a lonely stretch of road. Buford grabbed his keys, but this time he wasn't going alone. His wife, Pauline, had a bad feeling. She always worried, and that morning her worry was a physical thing. She insisted on going with him. It was a habit born of love, a small act of solidarity that would place her directly in the path of the hurricane. They drove through the quiet, misty Tennessee morning, the conversation likely turning to their kids, to the simple plans of a day that would never come. And then, in the rearview mirror, a black Cadillac moving too fast, closing the distance with predatory intent. It pulled alongside them. For a heartbeat, there was just the hum of 2 engines racing down an empty road. Then the world came apart. The morning calm was ripped to shreds by a sound that didn't belong there, a mechanical, stuttering thunder that echoed off the pines. This wasn't a pistol shot. This was a declaration of total war. The sheriff's car, a heavy fortress of American steel, became as fragile as glass. The windows didn't break, they vaporized into a million glittering fragments. The metal body was punched through again and again, perforated by a force that tore through it like wet paper. Buford felt a sudden, violent impact from the seat beside him. The sound of Pauline's voice was just gone. A final sharp silence replaced it, a silence more deafening and more terrible than all the gunfire in the world. Then an explosion of white-hot agony erupted in his own face. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was a demolition. He tasted copper and shattered bone. The world tilted, spun into a blur of green and brown, and then went dark as the car, no longer under any command, swerved off the road and crashed into an embankment. Silence returned, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder, gasoline, and blood. When Buford Pusser regained consciousness, it was to a world of pure horror. He was pinned behind the steering wheel, his own jaw a hanging ruin. He could see his own reflection in a shard of the mirror, a monster's face staring back. But that wasn't the worst of it. He turned and saw his wife. She was slumped against the door, eerily still. The woman who had been the calm center of his chaotic life, the reason for his impossible fight, was gone. In that moment, lying in the wreckage, something inside him broke forever. And something else, something far harder and colder, was forged in its place. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about a testament. His hand, slick and shaking, fumbled for the radio microphone. He keyed it, and a sound that was barely human, a rasping, gurgling whisper, broke the police frequency. He named the names. He gave them his killers. He was sure it was his dying breath, and he used it not to ask for help, but to sign a death warrant. The first deputies to arrive at the scene found a slaughterhouse. The car was a metal sieve, the air thick with the coppery smell of blood. They found Pauline Pusser, gone from the world. And then they found the sheriff, a grotesque sculpture of flesh and bone, somehow, impossibly, still breathing. His rasped words over the radio hadn't been a ghost's farewell. They were the first shots of a new war. The ambush had failed in its ultimate goal. It hadn't killed Buford Pusser. It had made him immortal. What followed was a medical odyssey. Buford was rushed from hospital to hospital, a puzzle of a man that surgeons had to piece back together. It wasn't one operation or two or even 10. It took 18 separate surgeries to rebuild his face. His jaw was wired shut, his features held together by steel pins and medical ingenuity. For months, he lived in a world of muffled sounds and liquid food, his grief a silent, suffocating companion. The physical pain was immense, but it was nothing compared to the gaping wound left by Pauline's absence. The man who eventually walked out of that hospital was not the same man who had been carried in. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard focus. The grief hadn't broken him. It had tempered him, like steel plunged into ice water. He was still the sheriff, he still wore the badge, but everyone in McNairy County understood that his mission was no longer about law and order, it was about retribution. The man they had called Buford the Bull was gone. In his place stood the beast, and now the beast was avenging his mate. News of the ambush swept through Appalachia like a firestorm. The brazen attack on an elected lawman and the murder of his wife was a line crossed even for the Dixie Mafia. It was an act of pure arrogance, a message that no one was safe. A massive manhunt was launched, fueled by Buford's dying accusations. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation got involved, and rewards were offered. The state line mob, for the first time, felt the heat of real, statewide scrutiny. They had poked the bear one too many times, and now the entire forest was coming for them. But the official investigation was just the public face of the hunt. The real story was being whispered in hushed tones in every diner and on every front porch in the county. People knew the system was slow, that lawyers could twist the truth. They also knew Buford Pusser. They knew his capacity for singular, relentless focus. The members of the state line mob knew it too. They had created a martyr, a widower with nothing left to lose. And as Sheriff Pusser pinned his badge back on his chest, his newly constructed face a grim mask, every soul in that lawless strip of land knew that the official manhunt was secondary. The real judgment was coming, and it wouldn't be delivered in a courtroom. Eventually, the wheels of state justice turned, and one of the men Buford Pusser had named from his pool of blood, a vicious enforcer named Carl Towhead White, was brought to trial. The McNairy County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. It wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle, a powder keg with a short fuse. The room was packed with armed deputies and wary onlookers, the air so thick with tension you could taste the fear. At the center of it all, a silent, imposing figure sat in the gallery. It was Buford, his face a permanent, ragged roadmap of the violence he'd endured, his eyes fixed on the man in the defendant's chair. Towhead White, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention. Flanked by expensive lawyers from out of state, he was the picture of defiance. He didn't show a hint of remorse. Instead, he wore a smirk, a look of smug confidence that told the whole world he believed he was untouchable. He was a creature of the state line, and he trusted in the power of money and intimidation to bend the law to his will, just as it had always done before. The prosecution put up its best fight, with Sheriff Pusser as its star witness. He took the stand, his rebuilt jaw making every word a deliberate effort, and he told his story. He pointed his finger at Towhead White and named him as one of the architects of the ambush that killed his wife. It was powerful, raw testimony. But the defense lawyers were slick and merciless. They twisted his words, painting him not as a victim, but as a violent, out-of-control lawman on a personal vendetta, a man so consumed by rage he would blame anyone. Without a murder weapon, without other witnesses willing to talk, the case began to fray. It was his word, his pain, against a wall of silence. Then came the verdict. The foreman of the jury, a man who refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room, read the words that would echo through the Tennessee hills for decades to come. Not guilty. A wave of disbelief and anger washed over the crowd. Towhead White's smirk broadened into a triumphant grin. He had beaten the system. He was a free man. But as the deputies escorted him from the courtroom, past the jeering crowds, Buford Pusser simply stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't make a threat. He just watched White walk away, his expression unreadable, a chilling calm that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The law of men had spoken, and it had failed. The gavel had fallen. The case was closed. But everyone in that courthouse knew this was not the end. It was merely the end of the part of the story that would be written down in official records. Now, a different kind of justice was about to be served. The unwritten, unforgiving justice of the mountains. The verdict of not guilty was just a legal footnote. In the hollows and back roads of McNairy County, a different kind of verdict was being delivered. One by one, the specters from Buford Pusser's past began to disappear. Carl Towhead White, the man who smirked his way out of the courtroom, was found shot to death in a motel in Mississippi less than 2 years later. Kenny Kirksey, another suspect, was gunned down. Louise Hathcock, the defiant madam of the state line, died in a fiery crash when her car inexplicably flew off a bridge. Law enforcement called it mob business and tragic accidents. But the people of McNairy County called it Pusser's justice. No one could prove his hand in any of it, but in their hearts, they didn't need to. The beast, they whispered, was balancing the scales. This raw, brutal story couldn't be contained by the Tennessee state line. It broke free and became an American phenomenon. In 1973, the movie Walking Tall hit theaters, turning Buford Pusser from a local legend into a national folk hero. He was no longer just a small-town sheriff. He was the living embodiment of every decent person's rage against a system that seemed broken and corrupt. He was the man who fought back when everyone else was told to just keep their heads down. The traces of that war are not gone. They're still there, waiting for you in Adamsville, Tennessee. You can visit the Buford Pusser home and museum, the house he shared with Pauline, and see the life they were trying to build. You can stand in stunned silence before the actual car he was ambushed in, a mangled relic riddled with the bullet holes that changed his life forever. A few miles down the road, a granite monument stands on the quiet shoulder of the highway, marking the exact spot where Pauline died, a permanent scar on the landscape. For years, his daughter Dwana was the keeper of the flame, a tireless guardian of her father's legacy, ensuring that the world remembered the husband and father, not just the unstoppable force of vengeance. These aren't just historical artifacts. They are tangible pieces of a man's soul, physical proof of the price he paid. The newspapers have moved on, and most of the world has forgotten. But the mountains remember. The story of Buford Pusser is woven into the fabric of that place, a ghost that still walks tall along those dark country roads. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning. How did a man sworn to uphold the law become the most feared beast in Tennessee? The answer, my friends, is that he didn't become a beast. The beast was always there, sleeping inside a good man. It was woken up by a world that refused to play by any rules but its own. When the law proved to be a shield for the wicked and a lie to the innocent, Buford Pusser reached for an older, harsher code. He became the monster the monsters were afraid of because they had left him no other choice. The story of Buford Pusser is more than just a tale of revenge. It's a brutal lesson, carved in scar tissue and written in blood, about what happens when good people are pushed too far. It is the quintessential Appalachian saga, a story of fierce independence, a deep distrust of corrupt authority, and the belief that sometimes justice isn't found in a law book, but at the end of a hickory stick. He endured unimaginable loss, but he never, ever backed down. He proved that one man, filled with enough righteous fury, could indeed stand against an army and make it blink. And in the end, maybe that's why his final chapter remains so unsettling. He survived the ambushes, the bullets, and the bombs, only to die in a single fiery crash on a lonely road, just a stone's throw from where he'd lost Pauline. The official report called it an accident, but in the hills of McNairy County, they know better. They believe the darkness he fought so hard finally found a way to snuff out his light with one last cowardly act. His death became the final, chilling piece of his legend, a mystery that will never be solved. He wasn't a perfect hero. He was a flawed and furious man who walked into hell and decided to kick the door down.